We are ready to start. I'd like to call our meeting to order. We have a quorum with Chris and David and myself. Nathan is not here today. Nathan McBrayer, another member of our committee. He is out of country, and Diane Reed is an alternate committee member for the Commercial Area Master Planning Committee is online listening via Zoom. And then Karen, how many people do we have online?
9.
Okay, super. All right. I hope you all can hear us well out there. So before we begin with the formal presentation, I'd like to ask the committee to approve the minutes from last meeting that we had on the 27th of January.
So made. Second.
Okay.
To approve the agenda as well.
Yeah, and for the approval of the agenda as well.
So made.
Good.
Second.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. So
You want to vote on it?
what's that?
You want to vote on it?
Yeah. Okay. We can vote on it.
Okay.
Yes. We approve.
Proof.
Good. Aye. Thank you. All right. Let me pull up slides here. If we could go to the first slide, please, Karen. So before we begin, I'd just like to give an acknowledgement to folks that have been involved with this so far. So first, I would like to thank Mayor Quinn and the council for appointing us to this committee and being involved here over the last couple of months. Certainly thanks to the team up here, to Nathan and to Diane as well. And for Brian and his team, for Hunter and Nicole for being here and being a part of this today and sharing with us what they've got as a draft proposed plan. And certainly for Chris, Jay, and Karen and Darcy, who have been intricately involved with this process as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to cover more on the public engagement survey that Brian will cover as part of his pitch. So I'll leave that piece to him, but I wanted to talk through just kind of where we've gone over the last couple months, some of which is up there and some of which I've got on my paper here. So on the 9th of November, we were appointed to this committee to begin our work as part of the Commercial Area Master Planning Committee. We sat that day for the appointment. On the 5th of December, we did a walkabout initially with part of the committee members, but then it ended up being with a bunch of the stakeholders as well, where we did about a 4-hour walkabout of all of the key areas on the island. We started in Mid-Island here. We went up to the harbor and the historic district marina area. Then we went down to the Conservancy in East Beach and walked through that and got input from folks on the walkabout. We used the information that came, and Brian will talk more about this in his presentation, but from the survey of over 200 respondents, we've looked at the work from the Vision 2025 statement that came out from 2017 that was done previous to this. And all of that input was used, as well as input from the committee and from the stakeholders, to influence what you're going to see today from Brian. Over the next couple months in December and January, we had informal meetings amongst ourselves here to make sure that what you're going to see here today reflects all of that, so that it was not a closed process. It was something that we had input to all along. And we've had several of those behind amongst ourselves doing that. On the 27th of January, we held a meeting amongst ourselves here formally with the committee. It was open to the public. We had a few people attend to listen to where that was going to go, making sure that we were on the right track, making sure that what Brian and his team put together was on the right track, and making sure that we felt as a committee that this was going in the direction it needed to be. From that, we then developed the statement that we've got here today that will issue some things about Brian's plan and his team's plan with Hunter and Nicole, as well as some things for council to consider as we move forward. The intent today is, after I'm done speaking here for just a little bit, is Brian proposes the proposed draft plan. And I want to reiterate that piece because I had somebody, one of our property owners ask me last night, well, when do we get to provide input? You get to provide input all along. We're always welcome to receive that, whether you email us directly or you email the village council directly. And we will take that. If you've not been able to, and on Zoom today, as Karen said, we've got about 9 people listening in. We will not be taking comments from the Zoom land, but we will take written comments up until the 24th of February. The intent of today's proposed draft is to make sure that's reflective of what we as a committee felt was important and what you all as stakeholders and property owners felt was important. So at the end of today, after Brian has presented, after I've issued our statement here from the committee, to do a public comment period afterwards. I don't think we've had anybody formally sign up, but you can still speak. So if you're here today, you can provide that input for 3 minutes here up at the podium. We will take that into consideration. And again, to reiterate for the 9 folks or whoever else has joined us online, up until the 24th of February, we take that information again. And then really I'll leave at the end of this period today, around noon when we end and after the public comments are done, to figure out the next step and the way ahead in terms of where council goes and what we do for the next steps. But again, what you're seeing today is a proposed draft. And then again, we are taking input on this process as we go through. All right, Brian, let's start with you and go through what you've got for us, please.
Thanks, everybody. Glad to be back here. It's 3 months since we were here in November to kick this off. There's a lot that's been done since then. So I'm going to start first in the intro, just to kind of remind everybody why at least we think we're here. And one is to acknowledge that, Bald Head Island Limited is sort of transitioning their role from where they've been over the last 40 years here on the island. And in doing so, the village is going to be taking on some additional responsibility. And we want to be sure, that everyone understands what's potentially to come here. And I say potentially, we're just going to be showing you a plan that is based on what the current zoning allows. Okay. Also, the other purpose is to help the council plan for future growth, which is really, really important that you're looking at this, because so often towns and villages and cities are always playing catch up because we have such rapid growth in this part of the country. If you can at least see what's coming, it might help you plan a little bit better. So that's a really good part of what we're doing today. So first want to remind everybody of the areas that are zoned commercially on the island and undeveloped. And on the far left, let's see, is there a little way to highlight these things?
Is that circular?
This thing in the middle? There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, the Marina Historic Area, which is up here. Obviously, by the way, just to orient everybody, this is the Atlantic Ocean, this is the Cape Fear River, this is the harbor marina area. The area around the grocery store and other development, which we have been calling the Mid-Island area, just to give it some kind of a name. And then, of course, the Conservancy East Beach area. There is a little bit of commercial, which is, I guess, technically the Bald Head Island Club, I guess, would be considered commercial, but that's not an area that we're involved in, and there won't be a whole lot of growth here. So those are the areas that we're looking at. The second map I wanted to show you is, again, just to show you kind of the infrastructure. This pink, a little bit hard to see with the lighting on. Would it make sense to maybe turn those lights off? Would that be helpful? Or I don't know if that might make it a little bit easier to see that, as long as you all stay awake. But you can see the pink. Is that better? Okay. Yes. You can see obviously the pink are the wines, and this is Steve Bonnet and Muscadine. But what I really wanted to point out is the green, and that is the Greenway Blueway, which some of you, I think most of you, are familiar with. And that is part of the original master plan. And it calls for a pathway along the edge of the Bald Head Creek. And then here it dips into the maritime forest. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And I wanted to at least have it on the slide so you could see where that is. Okay. Kevin mentioned this public engagement survey. If you recall, at our first meeting, we put a survey online and we had 224 respondents, which was really good. We're pleased with that. I'm just going to go through that with you quickly. We really asked 2 questions, and they pertain to each area. First is what uses should be considered as we think about this commercial land, and then the other is what elements should be part of these of this area, these uses, and I'll talk about that in a second. And again, you can see, again, based on the responses, shopping was one, food and beverage was, almost 80%, parks and plazas, that came through on all of them. That's very important to folks. And then you can see as we go over, and I really wanted to look at the other, because those are just comments that people made. Again, in the Marina Historic Area, there were folks that felt like maybe we needed public restrooms, a welcome center. There was some discussion about just sort of improving the whole tram ferry area. And some of these things are really a little bit out of our scope, but we wanted to at least understand where people were coming from. Maintain the historic village feel was important here. There were comments about both storage, more food, et cetera. And again, I don't know if is this online, if people want to look at it more closely. I don't remember if you still have it online. Yes, it is. Okay. Oh, it is not. Okay. And then some of the site elements, again, parks and Seating was almost 60%. Landscaping, huge, comes up all the time. 80% of the folks who responded thought we needed to really focus on landscaping, sidewalks, parking, and then other. Someone thought maybe a swimming pool in the harbor would be important. Water fountains, public restrooms, again, came up in terms of site elements. And then again, some of the comments, need for architectural review, better use of the vacant land that's there. As it relates to the Mid-Island area, the uses that were discussed there that are important, 60% thought more shopping or shopping on the parcels that are zoned commercial. 73% food and beverage, which is basically restaurants, parks and plazas again, and you can sort of read through there, looking at the other employee housing, public restrooms again, apartments or residential over retail was something. There's discussion about a school and a pet hotel, which, you know, some of those things are in the works. And again, you can see in the comments some of the things that were discussed as it relates to that particular area. Okay. Some of the site elements, again, parks and plazas, landscaping again is really high. Going over to the other additional screening that probably pertains to the development of the work that is actually being screened right now, right in front of this building, as a matter of fact, today. Discussion about an amphitheater. And then again, reading through the comments, public restrooms and entertainment area, pedestrian access improvements. And again, you're going to see some of these things come out in the plan. Over in the Conservancy in East Beach area, again, parks and plazas, huge, almost 70%. The Brown, the 25%, public restrooms again, public access to the beaches. You can see signage, wayfinding. Few comments. There's some who said no more development, less home sites, no hotel, just conservation land. And again, this is a little bit more sensitive area than maybe some of the others. So I think it was kind of a nod to that. Okay. Last thing is, again, site elements for this area, more landscaping, parks and plazas, again, the same thing that we have seen throughout some of these other comments. Public facilities, again, needed over there, better beach access. Okay. So now we're going to jump into the plan and we're going to start with the Marina Historic Area. And these are really just some sort of overarching themes that we've heard over and over again, not only in the survey, but also in comments and talking to folks, stakeholders at the last meeting, and also in our site walk. And circulation, the conflicts between carts and trams we heard. And again, as the island continues to grow, that area is getting tighter and tighter, and how we need to maybe look at those conflicts. And I'll show you some thoughts there. We also, the pedestrian connectivity, thinking about folks who are coming to the island maybe for the first time, want to get over to the lighthouse. It's very hard for them to figure out. And then when they do figure it out, they're kind of meandering through parking lots, and, you know, can we make that a better experience? And then just the comment about underutilized property, and primarily related to this parking lot that's sitting right here with beautiful views of the water. Okay. So here is the plan, and this is where we'll zoom in a little bit just to kind of set the tone here for the colors. Up here at the top, well, again, this is the ferry landing area, just to kind of orient everybody. This is where the barge comes in. This is where the ferry, where the tram parking is. Okay. And so the orange represents maybe some improvements to the ferry landing area. The red with that's supposed to be blue, but it looks like purple. That is commercial with office over it. And then the red is commercial with residential over it. And these are all uses that are permitted in this zoning category. Remember, everyone, we're showing you what is possible based on existing zoning. We're not making judgments on whether the zoning is appropriate or not. We're just showing what is presently allowed by your code. So starting at the top, the first thing that we wanted to discuss was this idea of separating the golf carts from the trams. And one of the things that we're looking at is actually cutting off the access to carts, perhaps here or maybe even further here. And we've had several comments, and really creating a drop off for golf carts. And if you can think of it as an airport where you come up and you drop stuff off, or you drop people off, and then you go and park. what we're thinking is maybe creating a place where we could drop somebody off here and then pull into a parking area that would be behind buildings that are presently in that parking lot. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, this is not a working drawing. This is not something that's going to be constructed. It's just starting to get at some of these issues that have come out. And whether or not this drop off, maybe moves a little bit closer to the ferry landing. We had heard comments about how maybe it's a little too far away, and we're going to be kind of amending this. But the point is, we need to think about separating those two as the island continues to grow, because it's getting more and more congested. Now, it's not a problem now, but in the height of the season, it does become a problem. And it's difficult as these trams are whipping through here, trying to get folks having that conflict is going to create some major problems as we continue to grow. So that's one issue. The other thought is that it's primarily down here is to consider building buildings along the edge of that existing street and putting a cart barn or a deck, as is really called, behind it that would accommodate not only the residential that would be above the commercial, it would accommodate parking for the commercial, and the commercial is probably going to be more like shops and restaurants. And then also some overnight parking, because we heard a lot about how it would be nice to be able to provide some short-term, perhaps overnight parking for people who live here and go off island and want to be able to come back and get their car. There's also, we need to make room, assuming that the rental carts are going to stay here, because it's very convenient when people get off to get a car. We need to make room for that. So this would be a 3-level parking area, and it would really only be 2 stories high, because the top floor obviously wouldn't need a cover on it. So we would line this street. This is the existing road that goes into the ferry landing. We would line that street with buildings, and then we would put a boardwalk across the front of it. Remember, these buildings all have to be elevated because of the flood line. So you can, if you can imagine going up into Delphina's or the coffee shop, how you go up several steps. Same thing with the Chandler. Same thing would occur here, and that would allow us to park under those buildings. In addition to that, there's also, this is the Camel line right here, which is the build to line, and there is permittable building allowed along this dune line. And what's envisioned here is some very small cottages, and I'm going to show you some images. And what we're suggesting is you might have a couple here, a couple here, a couple here, and perhaps create some boardwalks out to the beach for the folks who would be living above here, or folks that might come here. Right now, there's one right here. We're thinking maybe create another couple, not unlike, I'm going to show you an image of an example of it that's over in the harbor. Okay. In addition to that, there's a parking lot here where all those vehicles are. We're looking at maybe moving those back over closer to the barge area, because that's not the most beautiful view to see coming out of here, and it provides a little site for potential above it. And then there are 2 more, or 1 site and 2 more buildings here between the entrance to the barge and the bridge that are also buildable sites that could accommodate some additional commercial with residential. Great views for this residential, by the way, that would have parking behind it and under it. And again, that boardwalk would come across, and then right here at the bridge, if you could sort of scroll it up a little bit, thanks, Nicole. Improve this intersection. We've already done a sketch for that, where we just put a little bit of a hook on this road, make a little bit bigger median, and begin to fix this. This is not a very good intersection, but we can kind of fix that very easily. But we would create a spot right here where, again, visitors could come, and at this point they could make a decision either to walk over here, which I'll talk more about because this is a new museum, or they could get on the Greenway Blueway, which would start right here at the bridge and meander their way back around along this Greenway Blueway. Now, a word about the Greenway Blueway. We don't know exactly where all the right-of-way is for that. There is some, and there are actually pieces of it that have been built along, I think it's Lighthouse Landing and Timber Creek, if I'm correct, David, right? Yes. You built that. And so we're digging further into that, but the goal is long-term to be able to begin to separate people from the carts and trucks that are running down North Bald Head Line. You know, it's been fine up until now, but as we get busier, those conflicts are going to become more intense, and we think it's probably a good idea to begin to try to attract people to go, not everybody, but some here, and maybe even consider the bikes, but that's more to come on that. Here in the historic area, this is the plan at this point for a new museum. We're thinking we could bring a sidewalk right across the front of that and into the historic area. And then this is a plan for the expansion of Town Hall. And again, there's not a specific timeline on that, but we did want to put that on here. And the other thing that we contemplated here was on Ballaststone Alley, which is this road right here. Perhaps adding some angled parking along both sides. You know, it's a one-way street with a median, and we actually went over and looked at it in detail yesterday when we got here. We could do some nice parking with a boardwalk that could connect into the porch here to get, maybe create a little bit of, alleviate a little bit of the congestion right here around Lighthouse One. You know, people just kind of park sort of haphazardly. We could do that, but it could also be parking for the museum. So it would have two, you know, kind of a twofold purpose here. We'd also have a drop off, and there's some really nice trees that Chip Hemingway, the architect, has been working with Chris Webb and others to really make sure that this is sited. Again, not a whole, we're not going to get into that in detail, but the point is that the walkway would sort of come across the front of it. Okay. Nicole and Hunter, is there anything else I miss? Oh, I wanted to talk about the park. Also, the village owns this land up here, some really nice, beautiful property. And what we've contemplated here was the creation of maybe a small amphitheater, which would have this beautiful backdrop here. Also, perhaps a children's playground. These are some of the comments that we heard that could fit nicely kind of over here. And maybe leave the middle, which is open land for folks who just want to throw a frisbee or play with their dog. And then there's to be a new boardwalk and I guess kayak canoe launch here, which is yet to be built. Right, Chris? That's coming fairly soon, I guess, to replace this one. And then we thought it might be nice just to have kind of a strollway along the edge. So, you know, not a whole lot to be done here, but just more than just the kind of the vacant lot that it appears to be right now. The other thing I did want to point out to folks, and again, this is permittable, there's a little island out here. And Bald Head Island Limited pointed out to us that they are permitted to create a boardwalk over to here with maybe some kind of a boat launch or whatever. I don't know if that would be public or private. They don't plan to build any houses or anything, but this could also be kind of a nice amenity to get out there, out to the water. And just pointing that out and putting it on the plan, whether or not it ever gets built, you know, we don't know. Okay, so that's the first area. I think I'll maybe good. Is it okay if I just kind of go through all three and then we can come back to them if you want to ask any questions? Is that appropriate, Kevin?
Yep.
Okay. Just wanted to show you some images of how some of these buildings might sort of look and behave on the site. They are allowed to go up to 3 stories. That's what the zoning allows for. Or I think I think there's a number. It's actually 45 feet, which is about a 3-story building. But I think and I know these are shown as 2 stories, but the point is just to show you character. This is actually a building on Martha's Vineyard that I saw this summer that kind of reminded me of how a building could sort of work at Bald Head right along the water's edge. This is another building that has, you know, commercial on the first floor and residential above. Again, it's 2 stories, but you can imagine something like that might be appropriate. This is a great example of a boardwalk. I'm not really sure where this is, but you know, I mentioned that boardwalk along the edge of the street, the buildings kind of coming up to it, just very, you know, really nice wide promenade where you could have tables and chairs and pots and things, just make it very friendly, beautiful walkway from the ferry landing over into the historic area. And our very own Peter Quinn, the mayor, has provided some great sketches for us to start to imagine this. And again, if you can imagine, this is the drop off. This would be steps up because the buildings are up higher. And this could be that promenade that is heading over toward the lighthouse, which is back here. This is the drive. This is the drive that comes in to the ferry landing. And of course, the river is over here on this edge. So one of the things that we want to be sure is that the scale is right and the materials are right, no matter what gets built. again, this is the bridge kind of going over into the harbor neighborhood. The park is kind of back here. Again, just kind of an idea that Peter put together on how these buildings could sort of behave on the site. Here's the boardwalk, which is kind of behind the trees that would then cross over and lead into the Blue Way and over into the historic area. This could be kind of a shot of the amphitheater, again, looking out over the water, see Baldy and the chapel. Just again, just to begin to think about how this might look, because sometimes when we say commercial, people think of the worst, right? And we don't want people to be afraid of commercial if it's done in the right way. Here are just some examples of the cottages I mentioned that could go along the edge of the riverfront. Again, you know, one of these right there in the harbor, something that would be small in scale. I think we're thinking, you know, maybe 2 stories. This is 1. This is, I guess, technically a crofter, but just kind of that look and feel, not a real big bulky building over in this area. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the Mid-Island area, and these are sort of the overarching themes that came again out of comments and walking. One was just the need for pedestrian connectivity. What has happened is the development really started along Maritime Way with the grocery store and the hardware store, and it's sort of morphed over onto Edward Teach. If you recall, this was the jailhouse, right? The police station. The fire station is now commercial. So we're starting to see more commercial growth over on Edward Teach. We have a new building that's directly across from us that's going to have retail in it. There's some retail behind it. So it's really kind of starting to sprinkle itself throughout this whole area. And we don't really have a good way to get from place to place without having to get into a golf cart. So we wanted to look at pedestrian connectivity. The other thing is there's a lot of different architectural styles going on here. And, you know, that's not always a bad thing. It's good to have some variety. But we want to be sure that what's built here is there is some kind of continuity between all of it, because this is the one place on the island where there's just a lot of things happening. And then the other piece is there really aren't any parking requirements as it relates to commercial, and we need to start to get a handle on that. Parking is beginning to become a problem. I think many of you know who experienced this during the summer. So here is the plan that we put together. It looks like an awful lot going on here, but you know, there's a lot of land over here, but there are also going to be hopefully a lot of tree save. And we'll sort of start kind of at the top and we'll work our way down. The first thing that we heard was that we need to make some improvements to that intersection right here. And we can make some pretty easy moves to improve that. I'm not going to go into details, but it was a comment that we heard. And we'll talk more about that with Chris and his team. There is commercial zoning allowed along Muscadine. Oh, by the way, this is Muscadine. This is Edward Teach. This is North Bald Head Wind. Just to orient everybody, this is the Maritime Market right here. The hardware store is down here. This is room service. This is Maritime Way. Okay. So we really have several things going on. We have this zoning right here, which is really intended to be very residential in scale because there's residential all around it. And we've shown that here, which would be a commercial use on the first floor. And then on the upper 2 floors would be residential occupied by one property owner. And there's an example of this down closer to the Conservancy, which I'll show you in a minute. But again, very residential in scale, an alley across the back. So parking would be along the back. Perhaps some on-street parking along Muscadine, a nice sidewalk, but buildings just fitting into the trees and very much in character with what's up there. Okay. Then we have, this is Maritime Way, and along Maritime Way, we have all this land here between Maritime Way and North Bald Head Wind. Much of it is in wetlands, and that's what this represents, all this area here. But there is a building site up on the corner. So we would bring a building sort of up to that corner, but still amongst the trees. It wouldn't sit right on the corner. And what we want to do here is we want to ensure that buildings are on the street and parking is behind the buildings. That's the pattern that we think needs to be appropriate. And really, by and large, has occurred really along here. There's some parking along the street, but the idea is to put the parking behind the buildings rather than in front of the buildings. So it creates really great pedestrian life on the street. So you can see this building would be facing the street with its parking kind of behind it. Same thing here, across the street from the market. You'd have buildings on the street, again, commercial on the first floor, residential on the upper floors. And then we put parking back behind it. We don't think it's appropriate to probably put curb cuts along here. We want to create as much of a buffer as possible along Federal Road and direct the attention toward Maritime Way. As we slide down Maritime Way across from the hardware store and the cruise quarters building, same thing. Buildings, commercial on the first floor, residential above, parking behind. We've also shown stormwater. These aren't necessarily ponds that will have water in them all the time, but we do need to be sensitive, especially, some of this, all of the land on Malta is environmentally sensitive, and we need to pay particular attention to that. We're also thinking adding parking along the street, much like what is in front of cruise quarters and the Island Hardware is appropriate. And then we have a couple more building sites right here past the hardware store, again, that would have residential above commercial. As we turn the corner, this is a very big a good sized piece of property, I should say. And over here, we're thinking perhaps it wouldn't be it could be residential, it could be, there was need for some employee residential, but this would probably start to take on a little bit more of an industrial type character, given that this is all of the sort of contractor stuff. This wouldn't be this probably would be restaurants. It might be uses that are more related to businesses and working that's done here. As we come down the road, this is the public safety building that we're in front of. Right now, we've just done finishing up all the landscaping to go across here to begin to soften that and to reforest some of the trees that were removed as part of this development here. This is the building that is under construction across the street. We're actually talking with them about maybe revising their plan a little bit to put parking along the street rather than creating a parking lot in front, as I mentioned earlier. Hopefully we can work through that. And then as we come around here, down here would be more industrial uses. There's a mini storage right here that, again, is very appropriate for the uses that were happening at the time. But that use long-term might be better suited, kind of tucked back into the woods. And perhaps that could over time redevelop into uses that would be compatible with what's happening over here. It's one little site here, parking along here. And then as we slide up here, this is the other part of this sort of mid-island area that's really emerging as a nice little place. This is, again, jailhouse. This is the existing, what's the name of that? Does that building have a name? It's the old fire.
It's old fire station.
Station 32, thank you, Tiffany. Station 32 is here. We've talked to John Fisher, the owner, about, maybe over time, there could be a little liner building in front, since there's a lot of parking between it and the street. Bring that up to bring a building up to the street. This is another good sized piece of property here that could have, again, additional retail restaurants with residential hub. Here we think is a really good opportunity to introduce some public space. You heard folks talk about plazas and landscaping. Well, there's one area that is private, but it's quasi-public, thanks to Claude's generosity. That area right outside his building where people gather and sit in rocking chairs. That's a really important aspect of the kind of things that are happening here. We think it would be great if we could incorporate one in this part of the neighborhood, and perhaps this area could be that. Maybe it could be done somewhere else. There's another site here that could have, again, commercial with residential above. There's a site on the corner. There's another site here that could be along Muscadine, and you can see the parking's kind of tucked in beside and behind it amongst the trees with stormwater. I mentioned the idea of pedestrian connectivity. One of the challenges here is, this is where all the trucks are. It's not really a place we want to have a lot of human people walking to and fro, but there is a plan to put residential above some industrial type uses here. I think it's more storage of, residential for, I think, the market. And so one of the things we've considered is maybe putting a sidewalk along one side of this street right here and making a connection right along here, which there already is a sidewalk between room service and the spa right here. Isn't that right, Tiffany? I think there's one here. There's also one here. So that could be a good place for folks to be able to walk from here to here rather than to go all the way around. But at a minimum, we're going to have, we're proposing sidewalks along all of the streets so that if folks did want to do that rather than cut through here. But we have to be really careful. We've talked to the different business owners here on how the trucks move about. We just have to be really, really sensitive to creating something that is safe. It is not an obvious place to do it. I also wanted to mention there's another building proposed here that is Claude's building, and again, that'd be probably commercial on the first floor with residential. He's also, I think, maybe talked about a small hotel. So that pretty much sort of wraps up this area. Is there anything I missed? Okay, let's show you some images. So, you know, this cruise quarters is a great example of what we're talking about. More of this, right? Commercial on the first floor, residential above, maybe a little bit of landscaping to help soften it. This is a great building at Nantucket Island. I thought could, you know, serve as a great sort of example where, again, you could have porches on the front. It's very residential in scale, but again, it could go up to 3 stories. And this is a great example. Signage is going to be really important too. Again, Peter helped us by putting together another sketch. This could perhaps be Maritime Way, where you have buildings on both sides of the streets with some parking. But again, you can see porches, the articulation of what makes Bald Head special. And I mentioned earlier that there is an example of the buildings that we're talking about along Muscadine at a residential. This building exists on, I guess that's still Federal Road at that point, right? This is commercial with residential. I don't think it's presently being used as commercial, if I'm correct, but it was built for that purpose. And then the parking is along the side. But this is a great example of how that could fit in beautifully in a residential neighborhood. This is another shot of, and again, this is Muscadine from North Bald Head Wine, and you can see how those buildings would sort of sit amongst the trees. Perhaps this could be the building over there on the corner that I mentioned. I also wanted to show you, you know, we do need to have places where some of these uses are, and we are, you know, a village that needs to accommodate lots of different things. And this is that area back in the corner that I showed you that is there today. These buildings can reside there perfectly, acceptably, kind of behind, kind of and amongst the trees. Okay, last area we're going to talk about is the East Beach Conservancy area. And again, here are some of the things that came to light as we were talking to folks. One is the idea of just talking about parking for beach access. It gets very busy and it's only going to get busier out there. The discussion of creating, this says bathhouse, we're really talking about restrooms. We need to adjust that. Again, this was a place that we heard over and over again would be helpful. We're going to show you a strategy for not only here, but maybe all around the island. So it's not just focused on the East Beach area. And then whatever development is here, it needs to be low impact because it is a very, very sensitive area. So here we go. Let's start up at the Conservancy area. We showed that blue is a potential site for Conservancy expansion. I don't believe there's any plans to do anything right now, but we just wanted to show anything that was even talked about on this map with perhaps a little bit of parking. And then there's one other site that's over here at the corner, right behind the boat. That is a small site that could accommodate some small commercial with some residential above. It could be up to a 3-story building with some parking behind it and adequate buffering to protect the folks who are right behind. Very small scale, very residential in character. Okay, as we slide over, heading east, this is that building that I just showed you. That is that, you know, residential on the first floor. I'm sorry, commercial on the first floor, residential, 2 residential floors above. We have 2 more sites here that could accommodate that same use. And then the largest piece of property is down here at this down here at the corner. And the first thing I want to mention is there's a shear zone that runs through here, and a shear zone is an area that was created as part of the master plan for the island to protect this area with heavy wind and storms. And that shear zone runs all the way up here. You can see it right through here. I think it actually picks up down a little bit further down, if I'm not mistaken. So that runs through here, and there's no development here. There are provisions to allow for pathways and driveways, and maybe we could do a pathway through here, but we don't see any need to do any real development here. And so what we're calling for is to push it back along Shoals Alley, and again, small scale commercial on the first floor, maybe a little sandwich shop or two, folks who are out at the beach. Perhaps we can incorporate a restroom here, although I think Kevin and his group have some ideas of maybe putting it up here, if I'm not mistaken. But it could be accommodated here with parking behind, as I mentioned, so it's not visible. There's enough parking to accommodate the commercial uses, the residential uses, and even some additional parking for the beach goers. Okay. We also looked at parking. I didn't realize this, but there's actually parallel parking all along Station House Way from 39 to 42. And we need to look at ways to maybe make that a little bit more obvious to folks. But, and again, we didn't know it because we actually proposed some parking along here. So we're actually going to amend this plan to show that here. And what we talked about is instead of having parking up here, maybe we make this a drop off. And over time, people will start to think about maybe dropping off their stuff and their folks here and then parking and walking back rather than having this a place that's, all places for cars. And again, as I mentioned, Kevin suggested maybe this could be in his group, that perhaps that could be a place for a restaurant. I think I pretty much covered that. And then here are some examples of what this could be. And you can see the scale is different from what we've shown you before. These are buildings that are in the Seasconset area of Nantucket, which is a far east end of Nantucket, very similar to what we're talking about here. The houses are a lot smaller than maybe some of the ones on the beaches, but this is a little sandwich shop that sits there, right there in the commercial area. This is another commercial building. This is actually a little restroom that just sits right there on the street. Very beautifully fits in. I thought that provided a really great model for what we might consider. Again, thanks to Peter. Here's an image down at, what is the name of this road right here? This isn't Station House right here, is it?
I think so, and that's Shoals Valley right there.
Shoals Alley is right here.
And it goes in the Station House.
It is Station House, okay. So standing at Station House, looking back up with these buildings could sort of poke kind of through the trees, but again, maintaining the vegetation. And then this is another shot kind of out by the beach. This is the new development. This is kind of moving up towards Shoals Watch. This is some new housing that will be built here over time. And this is the pathway at 42. If I got that right. And just wanted to remind you, there's again that great example that we already have here. And then here you have it. Here's all three of them all together. And that really concludes this part of it. So I guess, Kevin, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you want to sort of entertain questions here or comments.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. We've got some time here before I get into our statement. So at this time, I'd like to offer up the opportunity for questions from the audience of Brian and the plan that he's presented here.
Want to maybe turn the light?
Sure.
Well, I wonder if, are we going to get to the point of how you bring about this kind of a vision? Very blue sky
Absolutely.
vision and the tools, the mystery. A lot of talk about architectural design and consistency. As we know, so far, commercial development has been extremely mixed, and there are some commercial and municipal that have been built without standards. So that's a future thing that you're.
It is, and we'll talk about that here.
Hold on.
Okay. Any other? Thanks.
Have a quick comment. I've been making notes myself while you're talking. use the expression could be allowed. And I think that's the core of what you're, well, and that's what Rex is referring to. It's like, this could be this and this could be that. Or that's exactly where we should be right now. And then one of the things that, you know, there's a lot of conversation, oh, the village could do this, the village could do that. There's plans that we've been already talking about in terms of long range financial. So it's critical that as these discussions happen, actual tools, where's the money coming from? We're talking about this. And we've already we were in Washington last couple weeks ago and going to Raleigh soon. Again, looking for partnerships to try and find the funds to do this stuff.
And you know, this again, the part of the goal here was just to begin to show what's possible, but then begin to put together the toolbox. So that as this development occurs, the village is getting the kind of development that the citizens want and what is appropriate for the culture of the island. And we don't have a lot of good tools right now, to be honest here. But they're out there and they're easy to find. But we also have to be sure that folks understand that this land is zoned commercially, and just to say we don't want it or it's going to go away is just not realistic. So that, to me, I think the better approach is to find the tools so that you can get the kind of development that you want. And this is the vision that, I mean, you know, we've been here for 40 years. This is another 40 years. This is not something that's going to happen over time. But you can see when you lay all this out, there's a lot. There's a lot there. And just ensuring that we have the appropriate tools to accommodate what is appropriate is really part of what we're trying to do. And we've already put together a list of, you know, the Greenway Blueway is a great example. If that's something that the village and the citizens think is important, we got to figure out a way to get the right of way to make it happen. That's just one example.
Anybody else? Okay. All right, thank you, Brian and Hunter and Nicole, for all your work on this. We appreciate it, and for working with us as a team and the rest of the input that we've received to get to where we are. And I think that is important to reiterate what Brian said. It's a plan, and where we go next is critically important. How do we get there? And what tools do we put in our toolbox that's agreed upon collectively by the large majority, and how we move this forward? It truly is a collective effort. And we want to make sure that we get to where we need to go in a planned manner.
I just say one more thing.
Yeah.
Some of you all participated in the blueprint, what Brunswick Blueprint 20. And you know, that's the comprehensive plan for the county. And it's a really important tool because this should the council decide to adopt it, I guess, over the next few months. This will be what you will use as your guiding document as you look at future development. And so I would encourage you all to look at part that pertains to Bald Head. It's for the entire county, but there's a whole section on Bald Head. I know a lot of you are part of it, but this is part of the framework. That's also really important.
Okay, what I'd like to do now, and I'm going to read, so forgive the reading portion of this, but it's been a carefully orchestrated thing from our side to make sure that collectively we had everybody's input here from the committee, and again, taking input from the surveys that we incorporate. So kind of the results of the 27 January meeting that we had a few weeks ago, after we've seen this, after everything's been pulled in, is really what you're going to hear. So we believe it's important to take a step back and carefully consider the impact of the rapid development on the island. The growth and the change on Bald Head Island has been rapid and constant. And while it's certainly brought about many positive benefits, it's also put a strain on our infrastructure, our resources, and our community cohesion. The development and some of its resulting impacts that do not align with the character of our island can have a negative impact on the quality of life for its residents and contribute to traffic and parking congestion, as well as other environmental concerns. So the CAMC, the committee up here, has reviewed BHI Limited's commercial design guidelines and the village's zoning ordinance. We've also reviewed the Vision 2025 work, which was completed in 2017. We've noticed many similarities in the Vision 2025 survey and the survey results obtained during the development of the draft master plan as obtained by Brian's team, and he's talked about the survey results up here, some of the key findings from that. The comments from the recent survey have been taken into account for much of what you've seen up here and what's going to be recommended below. Additionally, one of the resounding themes of the Vision 2025 plan was that of, quote, living in harmony with nature, a theme that we feel should be applicable not only to residential development, but to commercial development as well. And this too is reflected in our comments. We therefore recommend the following updates to the presented plan for consideration. And there's only a few here because most of this, after I speak to these 3 points, is going to be directed towards the village council in terms of what we do next. So first, the expansion of the waiting area for the pickup and drop off area. Brian's mentioned that, and we've talked about it before. Was expanding that area at the marina area. For the current plan right now calls for a waiting area, but it likely needs to be increased to a much larger size, especially to accommodate during peak periods. Second, exploring some type of screening along the backside of the Chandler Building and Jules Restaurant, along the walkway that lines the marsh on the backside of the wooden bridge, being mindful not to spoil the ocean view from the Marsh Bridge. One of the challenges, if you remember, that we have here is we're dealing with what's existing. And how do you separate the backdoor stuff of the village from the pretty part you want people to see? And it's hard to do that. We've already got that road back there, right? That goes up to line the backside there where they load up for the ferry. So the potential screening along that back walkway is what we're looking at. How do you potentially screen something there to hide the backdoor stuff? And then third, considering the defined placement of a welcome center in the near future, not as a possible option, and not as something that's dependent on commercial development. And I'm going to get more into that below towards the council in terms of their inclusion, but really figuring out a welcome center. How do the people that come over here for a day trip or for a week-long trip who have no clue what Bald Head is, figure out what it is? And then it's not dependent on the retail folks having to explain that to them. So those are really the 3 areas for Brian in terms of what we go back and look at. But the following, sir, this gets into your point on what do we want to do to get this codified. First, we recommend the institution of a technical review process at the village level for commercial design guidelines. Of note, we're aware that the village, led by the mayor and a few others on council and on staff, have begun working to blend Bald Head Island Limited's commercial design guidelines and the village's zoning ordinance into one cogent document. Going forward, we recommend that the commercial development and design review process should include clear guidance on when an application simply goes to the village technical review committee versus when submitted commercial development plans must be reviewed and approved by the village planning board and or the village council. Ordinance changes to utilize zoning mechanisms not currently utilized by the island, such as conditional zoning, may be necessary and should be considered. Some examples of things to consider under the design guidelines as developed by the village include the following. Commercial building design guidelines. Consider the review and inclusion of Bald Head Island Limited's current design guidelines, which outline building types to ensure that commercial buildings are developed within guidelines that mirror the stringent process required of residential construction. Ensure that where those guidelines might not fit our current needs, it be adjusted to reflect what we want to see as the future of Bald Head Island's commercial properties. Screening requirements. Consider offsets from rights of way and adjacent properties. Consider plant height restrictions and considerations. Consider submission of plant lists for site development. And consider types of screenings to be used, whether that's fencing or vegetative. And again, these are the same types of things that residential construction is subject to. Parking area considerations. Consider whether it's pervious surfaces or located under approved structures. Consider landscape medians. Parking area lighting plans. Parking lots not to be located within setbacks or buffer zones when possible. Landscaping in and around parking areas. The consideration of ADA parking, like they're dealing now with Tiffany and John's building up there in the corner. How do you do ADA access and where is that necessary? Required number of parking spaces commensurate with occupancy and compliance with the village code, which was something that Brian brought up during his plan. And then loading areas and trash pickup areas screened from adjacent properties. Water runoff plans to accommodate for groundwater, drains, downspouts, and gutters. Setback requirements from adjacent properties and specific mitigation measures for noise noxious odors and views. Consideration of tent use. Tents are normally approved for short periods of time, not as permanent structures. Define and enforce the tree removal process. Commercial development should be subjected to the same stringent standards as residential development. Paint color selection and approval process. Create a process for review and approval similar to residential development. And sidewalks. Consideration of sidewalk requirements to be built by commercial developers in front of buildings to connect with adjacent commercial properties. As part of the above recommended commercial development design and review process, consider the possibility of conditional zoning that might be included as part of the commercial design process, review process. If conditional zoning were implemented, commercial development applications under conditional zoning requirements could go to the planning board and then to the village council for review on a case-by-case basis. And then I've got a list of several other things here that I'm going to go down in terms of things that are not specifically related to the commercial development, but things that Brian has brought up during his plan that certainly need to be looked at and are very much in part in tune with the survey of Bulk Vision 2025 and the survey results that came from the 224 respondents. First, and Brian mentioned this many times in there, consider overall bathroom, and I'll remove the word bathhouse because we're really talking about bathrooms. Where's a place that you can go to the bathroom that's public access? So consider bathroom plans across the island operated by the village with a focus on meeting the needs of the overall island, not just on the Conservancy East Beach area. And I've got a list of specific locations here. Consider building a village-maintained public bathroom in the marina at the arrival dock. Consider building a public bathroom at Mid-Island to remove the responsibility from bathrooms for retail establishments. Consider building a public bathroom at the intersection of Muscadine and South Bald Head Wind near the new handicapped accessible beach access, which is 24, on the land that is already owned by the village. And if you recall, many of you probably know that's the old Mastech spoil pit that was over there on the corner. And then consider a public bathroom directly on Access 39. And Brian alluded to that in his plan. This building could be a small and unobtrusive one, similar to the one he showed that was in Nantucket, which is just a very small footprint right up on the access itself and built to fit the character of the island. The current draft master plan calls for a possible bathroom in the future commercial build out, which is a long ways off, but that responsibility should not necessarily reside with commercial property owners. And we think that really it goes to the overall plan of the village in terms of providing that for the public. Considering a public bathroom access at Access 42. Middle Island owns a small triangle of property at the backside of Access 42. The current lot there holds about 30 carts. Many of you probably are aware that there's probably 10 times that or 7 times that during peak seasons. We're not going to completely fix that, but you could potentially work with Middle Island Property Owners Association to see if they would sell that small tract of land on the backside of 42 to also place a bathroom down there. And again, in the Nantucket style, very small and unobtrusive spot so that we've got that. So the bottom line on the public bathrooms is the need for public bathrooms across the island has been repeatedly mentioned in surveys as a need for right now, not a need for the future, and not again dependent on future property development. And we believe that the village should take the responsibility for building and maintaining these bathrooms for public use, much like other municipalities do in public places. So that's the end of the bathroom piece. Carefully consider just how much commercial retail development is allowed at the marina. You've seen pretty extensive plans, and again, proposed draft, and we're not telling private property owners what they've got to do. We've got to create some type of a framework, but the village considering, do we really want to encourage more retail space at the marina, which is going to certainly impact the pedestrian and vehicular access up there to a large degree. The draft man right now calls for some pretty extensive commercial development up there. Next bullet is to consider the proactive purchase of property as the opportunity arises, either for future village use or preserving the land. Recognizing that we have such a limited amount of land left in the 40+ years that we've been developing, there's only so much left to go around. And so as the village sees the need to, or the potential for acquiring that land at their cost, at their expense, similar to what they did up in the marina for the pavilion tent area, taking that into consideration. And that's something that we had talked with Chris about and with the mayor about, which is they've got funds that they can use to do that when the need arises, where they can certainly consider that. And this is back into the Welcome Center thing that I mentioned before, considering the possible funding options for building, maintaining, and staffing a Welcome Center. People who visit the island right now have no place to go to learn about what exists on the island, except for visiting disparate locations like Old Baldy or the Conservancy, and then going, okay, where do I go next? And so looking at the options of creating a visitors bureau or a tourism development authority are two possible options that could be considered, possibly funded by the village, and certainly considered for assistance from the county or the state level to help fund that. Inherent in this possible option is an increased wayfinding signage plan, which Brian had talked about as well, which is how do you tie all of those pieces together for people to get from the marina to all of the other places on the island without walking down Federal with a map and figuring out how to do that on their own. So we think that that is certainly something that the village should consider. Next is considering a Parks and Recreation Department and creating one. Creating something that again has come up repeatedly in the surveys, which is the need for public green space and how does that managed? And right now, again, recognizing the village has a very small staff and is certainly strapped with the things that they have to do now. The creation of a department like that allows for the potential control of those pieces of property as they're acquired and then their future developed, and they have a plan for that. And then amongst that too is figuring out for the amphitheater up at the Harbor Pavilion area, what does the next step look like for that development? So what do we do as we move forward to develop that out? Because we don't need to wait for commercial development for that. That's something that we can do soon. And then this one here is for the easements for possible bikeways and walkway. Brian had mentioned it as planned, the Blue Way Greenway that traversed the island. This is again a long-term thing, and he did talk about the easement. And how do you get those, but figuring out now and starting to think ahead to how do you acquire that land from the folks that have got it, or getting the easements through pieces of property that they or others own, so that you can expand that and develop that further. Increased oversight of the contractor yard. There's certainly a lot of activity going on there right now. And as Brian mentioned, with the plantings going on, I mean, as we speak, they're out there putting in stuff and putting out things that have since cut away when they put the new buildings in over there, but hiding that commercial view, if you will, from the public, so that when we come up to this area, it doesn't look as it does now. And again, there's a lot of work going on. We recognize that certainly with the moving of all of the equipment down to the mulch site yard, but just keeping that going. This is kind of a random statement here, but certainly I think a lot of you can appreciate is the internal combustion engine use across the island has skyrocketed since Florence. How do we get control of that again and start to enforce that, not just with the vehicular movement across the island, whether that's weekend, weekday or whatnot, but then how do you hide those vehicles when they're done? Brian talked about moving that corner spot as you come in from the marina and come around the corner where all the Spectrum trucks parked. They got to go somewhere. But do we need to have them there, and how do you screen those in other places to include, like up here at the contractor yard? And then here is a statement, and I would credit this to Chris from the Conservancy, is considering the speed with which commercial development takes place and is allowed to progress. We have a problem now with homes being built more quickly than the permitting and oversight process can provide effective oversight and compliance for. From a Conservancy perspective, the pace of commercial development is also important to understand, so we can see how the island's ecosystem responds. Rapid changes have consequences that we sometimes don't detect until it's too late. As an example, the tree cutting guidelines that are consistent among entities across the island, but there is no way the village or the Bald Head Association can properly monitor for and provide oversight for the excessive tree cutting taking place now at the current pace. A slower pace of development would provide for more adequate time to educate contractors as well as new homeowners. By setting forth a planned timeline for development, the village can more effectively manage the process to achieve the expected outcome of compliance. And then finally, as the village moves towards codifying the draft master plan into village zoning and ordinance processes, our committee asks council to consider the desired future role for the commercial area master planning committee and what we might do next as part of that process. So really what this comes down to, the nuts and bolts, is what are the next steps and what does it look like? Certainly it hasn't ended here, right? This is just the draft. We're going to take comments at the end. I've got one more piece that I'd like to share in my conclusion. But what do those next steps look like? What we think they look like is this. In the end, I think we all want the same thing. We want the opportunity to get this right this time and set rules in place that ensure Bald Head Island's few remaining commercial properties are properly developed to fit the character of our island and ensure its viability for years to come. The purpose of the village placing a moratorium on development of all unimproved commercially zoned property is to allow our committee to bring back to the village a set of guidelines and zoning initiatives that would align with a master plan for the island. Allowing one or two projects to move forward before the commercial guidelines are in place would appear to be irresponsible on the village's part, as well as politically motivated. An extended moratorium on all unimproved commercially zoned property will provide us with an opportunity to continue to reassess our current policies and procedures, as well as engage in a meaningful dialogue with residents and stakeholders to determine the best path forward. This would ensure that commercial development of the unimproved commercially zoned properties are in line with the values and priorities of our community, that they're designed to meet the needs of all residents now and in the future. Therefore, the Commercial Area Master Planning Committee strongly recommends the extension of the current moratorium on development of all unimproved commercially zoned properties on the island till the zoning and ordinances can be set in place that codify the proposed master plan. And this would very likely take upwards at least another 9 months. That is what we have to share. I would welcome public comments at this time. I would please ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. And again, for those who are online, you've got the opportunity per the public notice to submit those comments up through the 24th of February, and we will certainly take a look at those as we take the next steps here in the process.
Really as much a question as anything else. Are there impediments to being able to institute at a village level design guidelines? In other words, are there any legal issues with that? Or is that something that clearly is within the authority of the village to say to institute a guideline? Because right now, as I understand it, Limited's plan is to transfer their review powers over to very local commercial associations to regulate themselves with regard to this standards. So I think it's crucial. It's a big question of the extent to which we can integrate that.
Will, are you on?
I am.
Can you take that for us, please?
Sure. There are this is Will Quick, Village Council. There are limit. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, Will is with Brooks Pierce. He's one of the village attorneys, and so we've had him looking into this for a while. Okay, Will, you're on.
There are limitations on design guidelines the municipalities can impose with respect to residential property. There are not the same limitations on commercial property. And so, to the extent that we are looking at design guidelines for commercial properties, that is generally permissible. There may be, some areas where we would not want to delve into, but broadly speaking, commercial design guidelines are acceptable in North Carolina.
I want to state that question. When Brian got started on this whole project, when he started working, it became very clear that the scope of his work is, and what we're looking at. There's a whole series of studies that need to be done that have come out of this. Pedestrian traffic. The question about ICE vehicles has always been an issue on this island. So full transportation analysis that needs to be done on this island. We talked to a number of people the underuse of our public spaces right now. We have a beautiful park down in Acre Station that isn't used. And there's also pedestrian and bicycle traffic. Every time there's a study or a poll taken, people talk about wanting to get on walking bicycles. How come that isn't? It should be one of the focuses. Those are all independent studies that will dovetail with future planning master plan. And the village has, as council has already started talking about how to fund those different things and where we're going to do that.
And this is Will again. I'll just add one additional thought that occurred to me as, particularly as Brian, was presenting and as I assume you all are seeing the same, sort of 3 areas of the island that I'm looking at. But we talked about, there was conversation about tools. There are different ways to sort of achieve a lot of what, has come out of this plan or recommendation. The design review process is one, but changes to how the village zones might be another. And there are different tools to use in zoning. The village traditional or has what is sort of known as traditional or conventional zoning districts, but there are conditional districts that can allow for sort of individualized development on particular properties. There are form-based districts that look at things like form, mass, density of structures that are acceptable under North Carolina zoning law. And so there's some different, mechanisms that could be used to achieve some of these goals beyond the idea of the design guidelines that might be worth considering for the village going forward.
The only other comment that I would have is, talking about any of this stuff. The village ends up in a lot of these sentences, yet we really do have to be looking at this as a concert between, the village, the association, developers. I mean, all these people put input, all players in, and stuff like that. The idea of, trying to set up a joint venture, bad use of words, but this should be looked at as a communal effort as opposed to a village.
No other comments, questions? Okay, I would reiterate again, for those of you online or for those of you inclined here to not speak right now, if you've got other input, then we do absolutely welcome that. As we use that to determine what we do next to present this to council. This is not a receipt to council today of this report. We will have to do that at a separate time. And so this really was the intent, was to brief you as the stakeholders and those online to see where we're at with the proposed master plan. And then, you want to
I thought she asked,
what's that?
were there any questions? I thought that online on the Zoom call, there was possible questions, whether or not
Yeah,
that works.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure they were heard.
All right, so we will figure out the next steps for what happens next in terms of taking the receipt of any comments that have come in between now and the 24th of February, and then figuring out what the next steps look like as we present this formally to council for the receipt of this report, and then determine the next steps from there.
Right, Kevin, I was gonna mention, we still do have one more step to make revisions to this based on
Right,
feedback from today and comments.
right, and that'll be
This is not the final plan.
absolutely, yeah, this is not the final plan. There will be more to come after we get that. Tiffany?
So does the village council have to approve the moratorium, the extension of the moratorium?
Yes, they do. Very good question. And so Peter, do you want to speak on that at all, or how that process, or?
We're just an advisory board.
There's a whole, there's windows that we have to announce that.
Hey, Will, are you still online?
I am.
Bill might be our best bet on that
Why
one.
don't you outline it for us?
I couldn't quite hear the question. It broke up a little bit. I'm sorry.
Well, the question is, if there's an extension of the moratorium, what is the process the council would have to go through?
Okay, so the current moratorium is set to expire on March 17th. And so council, in order to extend it from that date forward, would need to give notice, or there would need to be a notice given prior to that meeting, a public hearing at that meeting. And then sort of as far as the standards go, council has to have sort of legitimate basis to extend it. Based on the recommendations here, the forthcoming still Brunswick 2020 plan, it would seem that there's, a good reason to consider extending that. So that's sort of the high level overview.
There's set intervals about extending it, isn't there?
I'm sorry, Mayor, you're maybe a little far from the mic, so it's kind of hard, maybe hard to hear you.
Yeah, well, is there specific time limitations if you did extend the moratorium? Is it a 30-day extension, a 9-year extension? What do we have?
Yeah, no, state law does not set any specific time limitations on how long a moratorium can be active. The overall sort of requirement is that it needs to be tied to a legitimate basis, legitimate public interest. And so moratoriums, I'm aware of at least 2 that are ongoing in parts of the state that have been ongoing for over 2 years. There may be, I believe there's some case law on an outer limit of about 5 years, but don't quote me on that. But we're well sort of within the reasonable time period at this point.
Just to add to that, this committee recommended at least 9 months. So in the 9 months, I mean, part of that is to continue to, because we talked about this at the council retreat with respect to the Unified Development Ordinance, to codify the mechanisms, the tools at which to implement this master plan. So, it's just a matter of how long does it take to work through that process with the UDO development. And as Will said, 9 months at least is probably aggressive, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, rather than put a time frame on, figure out what you want to accomplish and then we can back into the time. Right? And the ones that I've been involved in, based on the things that you're talking about, are probably about a year. If you just ask me to guess, I don't, it's not 5 years, it's not 2 months. But if you're trying to get, your ordinance updated and maybe a few of these other things, you don't have to have a moratorium to study your greenway, but you probably need it to make sure that whatever development occurs, you have those tools in place to ensure you get your design right, your form, and all the things that we talked about.
What we said also at the retreat was, from a practical standpoint of sort of transitioning Cole Stones and Nest into that process, because obviously, given your all's work to date on this effort, there's no sense in.
We could help you figure out how much time it would take though. So, you don't want it to be any longer than it needs to be, in fairness to folks who have projects in the works or want to do, but you just want to ensure that when it comes, you're ready for it. You have the tools to do it.
Well, I think if we're going to set a time, we have to be able to justify.
Absolutely, and that's why I think it's, you figure out what you want to do, and then we can help you figure out the time, because you've got to have justification, because anything you do, you're subject to, unfortunately, lawsuits. You want to be sure you're protected as a village.
That's right. And really it comes down to, a sort of reasoned consideration of what, of the goals and how long it would take. And we are doing that, through this process for everyone involved. This is part of the reason sort of consideration that we're making. We're not just saying 5 years, that's what we need. We're working to get to a point. And everyone might recall that we had an initial 30-day moratorium when this all began, simply to figure out how long it might take. And so it's entirely reasonable that council may decide, we want to take a 2-month, make a 2-month extension now because that's how long we need to figure this out, and then extend it again. Those are acceptable, ways of doing this if we don't know by the March 17th meeting.
Okay, any other comments, questions? All right. This time I'd like to propose that we adjourn the meeting. Okay. Yeah.
We'll give it to him.
I voted yes.